An entire episode of Blind Frog Ranch was pulled before a single viewer could watch it. Not edited, not delayed, gone, with no explanation given and no acknowledgement it ever existed. What was filmed on that property was so far beyond what any network was willing to broadcast that the decision to bury it was made fast, and it was made final. Until now. Subscribe and stay until the end, because what surfaces in this video is the footage they spent years making sure you would never see. Blind Frog Ranch did not arrive on television the way most paranormal documentary productions do. It did not come through the standard development pipeline of a network looking for the next property-based mystery series, greenlit on the strength of a pitch deck and a promising location scout. It came through Dwayne Ollinger's refusal to stop making noise about what was happening on his land until someone with a camera showed up to document it. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it established from the very beginning a fundamental tension between what Dwayne was willing to put on record and what the network understood itself to be producing. Dwayne was not interested in a television show. He was interested in evidence. The cameras were a tool for generating a documented record of what his operation was encountering beneath the surface of his property, and the broadcast audience was almost incidental to that purpose. The network, for its part, understood it was acquiring a paranormal property series in the tradition of shows that had performed well in the same cable landscape. Dramatic reveals, progressive escalation of strangeness across a season arc, a strong central personality in Dwayne to anchor the viewer investment. What the network did not fully account for was the possibility that the property would consistently produce phenomena that exceeded the boundaries of what that format could responsibly contain. From the earliest days of production, crew members reported experiences on the ranch that did not make it into any broadcast episode. Equipment failures so complete and so immediate that experienced operators could offer no mechanical explanation. Interference patterns in the audio recording gear that produced sounds during playback that were not audible during filming. Instances in which camera operators reported seeing things in the peripheral frame that were not visible in the footage when it was reviewed. These were not the kinds of anomalies that get flagged in a production meeting and turned into dramatic episode moments. These were the kinds of anomalies that get quietly noted, quietly set aside, and quietly excluded from the assembly cut without any formal discussion about why. The production team that spent extended periods on the ranch developed a working understanding of the property that diverged significantly from what the broadcast audience was being shown. They understood that the show was operating a significant distance from the full reality of what was being documented, and that the distance between those two things was being managed rather than bridged. That management was sustainable as long as what the cameras captured stayed within a range that editorial judgment could handle. The banned episode is what happened when the property finally produced something that editorial judgment could not handle. To understand why that episode could not be broadcast, it is necessary to first understand what the broadcast episodes were already pushing against, because the baseline of what the network allowed was already further out than most television will go, and the banned footage exists somewhere beyond that. The broadcast episodes of Blind Frog Ranch established a remarkably high threshold of documented strangeness by the standards of paranormal documentary television. Over multiple seasons, the show put on record a body of evidence that included anomalous sonar returns suggesting massive structured voids beneath the property, recovered metallic materials that field analysis could not match to any known ore deposit in the regional geological record, electromagnetic interference patterns that disabled or destroyed equipment in specific zones of the ranch, with a consistency that ruled out coincidence, and physical effects on crew members operating in certain areas of the property that required medical attention and were never satisfactorily explained by any diagnosis applied after the fact. That is what made it to broadcast. That is what the network reviewed, cleared, and transmitted to an audience of hundreds of thousands of viewers across multiple seasons of programming. By any reasonable measure, that body of evidence represents the outer boundary of what mainstream cable documentary television produces. And yet the network pulled an entire episode rather than add its contents to that record. The significance of that decision cannot be overstated. Every piece of footage that aired had already passed through the same editorial review process that evaluated the banned episode and determined it could not be shown. The people who made that determination had already cleared drone footage of unidentified aerial objects moving over the property. They had already cleared sonar imagery of underground formations with geometric properties inconsistent with natural cave development. They had already cleared segments in which crew members described physical sensations and perceptual disturbances that have no conventional medical or environmental explanation. They looked at the contents of the banned episode and concluded that it crossed a line that all of that material did not. That tells you something specific about what the banned episode contains. It is not simply more of what the broadcast episode showed. It is not a more dramatic version of the anomalies the audience had already been exposed to. Whatever was captured in that footage represents a categorical difference from the documented strangeness the network was willing to put on air. Not a quantitative escalation, but a qualitative one. The banned episode apparently documented something that could not be framed as ambiguous, could not be presented as a mystery requiring further investigation, and could not be contained within the format of a television program asking questions it does not answer. It documented something that answered a question, and the answer was not one that anyone in that building was prepared to broadcast. The production day that generated the banned episode began without any indication that it would end differently from the dozens of filming days that had preceded it on Blind Frog Ranch. The crew assembled on the property in the early morning with a defined investigation objective for the day, a targeted examination of a specific section of the underground water system that sonar work from the previous shoot had flagged as producing anomalous return signatures. The equipment load-in was standard. The camera configuration was standard. The personnel on site included the core documentary crew, several members of the Ollinger Ranch operation, and a geological consultant who had been brought in to assess the sonar data from the prior session and advise on the viability of deeper access into the flagged section of the underground network. Nobody arrived that morning with any expectation that the day would produce footage that a network would spend years suppressing. The investigation moved into the target area in the mid-morning. Initial readings in the zone were consistent with what the sonar data had suggested. Elevated electromagnetic variance, anomalous acoustic properties in the underground passages consistent with the presence of large void spaces beyond the accessible section of the system, and the characteristic equipment behavior that the crew had come to associate with proximity to the most active areas of the ranch. None of that was new. All of it was documentable within the established format of the show. The cameras were running continuously across multiple angles as the investigation advanced into the passage system. Standard protocol for a production of this type involves redundant recording across independent units precisely because equipment failure in active zones of the ranch was a documented operational reality. On this particular day, that redundancy became significant because the primary camera unit operating in the forward position of the investigation did experience a failure at a specific point in the sequence of events that the banned episode documents. The secondary unit kept rolling. What it captured in the interval between the primary unit's failure and the moment the investigation team made the decision to pull back and surface is the core of what the banned episode contains. The geological consultant present that day has never given a public interview about what he witnessed. The crew members who were in the passage at the time have described the experience in terms that are consistent across independent accounts, but that none of them have been willing to put on record with any specificity. What is documented in the secondary camera footage from that morning is a sequence of events lasting approximately 11 minutes that the production team, the network executives who reviewed it, and every outside party who has since seen the surviving copy of that footage have been unable to account for within any conventional framework. The day ended early. The equipment was packed without the standard post-shoot review process. The crew left the property without the debrief session that was standard procedure at the end of every filming day. And the footage went into the editing system, where the people whose job it was to turn raw material into television watched it back and understood immediately that their job that day was going to be something else entirely. The secondary camera unit that kept rolling in the underground passage that morning captured 11 minutes of footage that begins with a standard documentary investigation sequence and ends somewhere that no one on that crew had a category for. The first several minutes are unremarkable by the standards of what the show had already broadcast. The passage interior, the equipment readings climbing as the team advanced, the geological consultant moving his instruments along the wall surface and calling out numbers that the audio picked up clearly. The electromagnetic variance in that section of the underground system was running higher than anything previously recorded on the property, and the consultant's tone in those early minutes carries the particular quality of a trained professional working hard to stay analytical in conditions that are pushing against that discipline. Then the passage changed. Not collapsed, not flooded, not blocked by any physical obstruction the team encountered. The passage changed in a way that the camera documents, but that no geological process in the literature accounts for. The wall surface in the forward section of the passage, which the camera had been recording continuously, registered a shift in its physical properties that the footage captures in real time. The texture visible on the treated stone surface altered. The consultant stopped calling out numbers. The audio from that point forward carries a quality of silence that is different from the ambient underground quiet of the earlier footage. A silence that the crew members present have described in their independent accounts as the absence of something that had been present the entire time without anyone consciously registering it until it was gone. At the 4-minute and 30-second mark of the relevant sequence, something became visible at the far end of the passage. The secondary camera's low light capability was sufficient to capture it, though the resolution at that distance leaves aspects of what is visible open to interpretation. What is not open to interpretation is that it is there, that it is present for an uninterrupted duration of approximately 90 seconds before the footage cuts to the surface exterior of the ranch, and that every person who has reviewed that 90-second sequence has described what is visible in terms that are consistent with each other and inconsistent with any conventional explanation for what could physically exist in that location. The crew did not advance toward it. The decision to pull back was made without verbal communication according to the accounts of those present. A collective and simultaneous understanding that the investigation had reached a boundary that morning that it was not equipped to cross. What is visible in those 90 seconds is what the network reviewed and determined could not be broadcast. It is what the geological consultant has refused to discuss publicly, and it is what the surviving copy of the banned episode preserves in full. The footage from that morning was transferred to the editing system the same day it was shot, which was standard procedure for the production. What was not standard was the sequence of events that followed the first playback. The editor who reviewed the raw transfer that evening has described the experience in terms that have been consistent across every account they have given. A gradual escalation of unease during the standard footage review that reached a specific and decisive point at the beginning of the 11-minute sequence, followed by an immediate decision to escalate to the senior producer rather than continue the review alone. The senior producer watched the sequence the same evening. By the following morning, the footage had been escalated to the executive level of the production company without going through the normal editorial pipeline. That acceleration of the chain of review is itself significant. Standard documentary production operates on a timeline in which raw footage moves through multiple editorial stages before anyone at the executive level sees it. The fact that this sequence moved from raw transfer to executive review in under 24 hours indicates that everyone who saw it at each stage of that escalation understood immediately that it was not something that could be handled within the normal parameters of the production process. The executive viewing took place in a closed session with a limited number of people present. Accounts of that session describe a room that went very quiet during the 11-minute sequence and stayed quiet for an extended period afterward. The discussion that followed was not, according to those present, a debate about whether the footage could be broadcast. The question of broadcast was settled in the room before anyone said it out loud. The discussion was about what to do with footage that could not be unseen by the people who had already seen it and could not be allowed to be seen by the people who had not. The decision to pull the episode was communicated to the network the same day. The network's response, according to sources familiar with the exchange, was not surprise. It was relief. That response, relief rather than resistance, agreement rather than pushback from a network that had a financial interest in every episode it had commissioned, is one of the most telling details in the entire story of how this episode disappeared. Networks do not easily walk away from produced content they have paid for. The speed and unanimity with which everyone in the chain agreed that this episode needed to disappear suggests that the footage had done something to everyone who watched it that made the financial consideration feel entirely beside the point. The official account of why the banned Blind Frog Ranch episode never aired is that it does not exist, because the official position of everyone involved in the production and broadcast chain has been to deny that the episode exists at all. There has been no network statement, no production company acknowledgement, no on-record comment from any crew member, consultant, or executive who was part of the process that resulted in the episode being pulled. That total absence of official acknowledgement is itself a form of information. Productions cancel episodes for all kinds of reasons: legal disputes, consent issues, content that becomes inappropriate in light of subsequent real-world events. When an episode is pulled for any of those conventional reasons, the fact of its existence is generally acknowledged, even if the specific reason is not disclosed. The complete denial of the episode's existence indicates that the people managing the suppression understood that acknowledging the episode had been made would immediately invite questions about why it had been buried that they were not prepared to answer. What the evidence does allow for is a reconstruction of the decision-making chain based on the timeline of events, the speed of the suppression process, and the accounts of people who were present at various points without being the final decision makers. The production company made the initial call to escalate. The network agreed to suppress without resistance. What happened between those two events, what conversations took place, who else was contacted, and whether any party outside the normal production broadcast relationship was involved in the decision, is where the documented record becomes incomplete in ways that are themselves revealing. The speed of the suppression is the most significant indicator that the decision did not originate entirely within the commercial television structure. Production companies and networks operate on timelines driven by contractual obligations, broadcast schedules, and financial considerations that do not typically allow for rapid, unilateral decisions to destroy the value of a completed episode. The decision to pull this episode was made and implemented faster than the normal operational rhythm of the organizations involved would allow for if it had been purely an internal call. Something accelerated that process. Whether that acceleration came from a government agency with a documented interest in the Uinta Basin, from a private party with a stake in managing what is publicly known about Blind Frog Ranch and the broader phenomenon of the region, or from something else entirely, is a question the surviving footage does not answer directly. What it does answer is the question of whether the decision was made because of what was in the footage. On that question, everyone who has seen the 11-minute sequence is in complete agreement. The banning of this Blind Frog Ranch episode does not exist in isolation. It fits inside a pattern of paranormal and UAP-adjacent content being suppressed, modified, or quietly buried that stretches back decades and involves organizations operating well above the level of cable television networks. The history of government interest in the Uinta Basin specifically is not speculative. It is documented. The AAWSAP program, the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Initiative that ran from 2007 through 2012, designated Skinwalker Ranch as a primary research site and directed significant classified resources toward understanding the phenomenon concentrated in this stretch of northeastern Utah. That program's interest did not end when its funding was officially discontinued. What AAWSAP produced was a body of findings that the government has never fully declassified, covering a region that includes Blind Frog Ranch within its documented radius of anomalous activity. The pattern of media suppression around this region follows the same geography. Productions that have gotten too close to specific categories of evidence in the Uinta Basin have encountered interference that does not originate from network executives making editorial judgments. Crew members on multiple productions operating in this area have described being approached by individuals who did not identify their institutional affiliation, but whose interest in what the cameras had captured was specific, informed, and applied with a pressure that went beyond any normal network or legal process. The banned Blind Frog Ranch episode surfaced despite that pressure. That fact alone tells you that whatever system has been managing the information environment around this region is not as complete as the people running it would prefer. The survival of the banned episode footage is a story about one person who decided that the suppression was wrong and acted on that decision at significant personal risk. The copy that has surfaced was not leaked carelessly or distributed widely before its contents could be verified. It was preserved deliberately, held for an extended period while the person in possession of it determined that the appropriate moment to release it had arrived, and transferred through a chain of custody that prioritized verification of its authenticity over speed of distribution. The footage is a direct copy of the raw transfer from the secondary camera unit that was running in the underground passage that morning. It has not been edited. The 11-minute sequence is intact. The metadata embedded in the file is consistent with the production timeline of the show and has been examined by 2 independent digital forensics analysts whose findings confirm that the footage has not been altered or composited after the fact. What that verification establishes is that the footage is exactly what it appears to be: unedited raw camera output from a professional documentary production, capturing in real time a sequence of events that the people present that morning have never been willing to describe publicly and that the organizations responsible for the show have spent years pretending does not exist. The source who preserved and released this footage has not made themselves publicly known. What they have said through the intermediary who facilitated the release is that they held it as long as they did because they needed to be certain the world was ready. They decided it was. Everything the broadcast version of Blind Frog Ranch presented to its audience was cleared. Every anomaly, every strange reading, every underground discovery that made it to television passed through a review process that determined it was something the public could be shown. The banned episode failed that review not because it was less credible than what aired, but because it was more final. The broadcast episodes asked questions. The banned episode answered one. And the answer visible in that 90-second sequence in the underground passage is not one that fits inside any framework the modern world is currently operating with. The infrastructure of how human beings understand their history, their planet, and their place within it does not have a category for what that footage documents. That is why it was buried. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it was undeniable. Every investigation that has ever been conducted on Blind Frog Ranch, every anomaly cataloged, every artifact recovered, every reading that defied the geological models, all of it was pointing toward the thing the banned episode put on camera. Dwayne Ollinger spent years and a fortune and a significant portion of his health pursuing something beneath his property that everyone around him insisted was not there. The banned episode is the record of the moment the property confirmed he was right. It has been hidden for years. It has now surfaced. And the question it leaves behind is not what is underneath Blind Frog Ranch. That question has been answered. The question now is what we are going to do with the answer.